Hi everyone, Talia from Zart Art. Today we're going to be making a foam print using tissue paper and layering our images. So to make our foam prints, we've got a sheet of printing foam here. We've got some cartridge paper as well as tissue paper, which will help us with our background. And we've also got some foam tape, which will help us to create layers. And for printing, we'll just be using this chromacryl acrylic paint instead of a block ink, because this one should give us a really nice coverage and it's not too expensive either. So to start off with, I've got my foam sheet and I've got my image here. So this little image will be the piece that we'll be working with. So we're going to make a few prints of the same thing. So I've just drawn my draft here, and what I'll do is trace it onto my foam. Now I've got an A4 sheet of foam, which is more than I need. So what I'm going to do is just cut a piece out to begin with, especially if you're working in a school and you're getting your kids to share some foam between a few students. You might want to cut it out before the lesson, so then you have a good idea of how much you'll need. So I'll just make sure that I do have enough to fit the image. And the foam is very, very easy to cut too. So now I can just put that to the side, be working on a piece this size. And I'm just going to lay my image over the top and use a pencil. A blunt pencil is really good for this because you don't want to pierce your image. So if you're drawing your draft on a piece of paper, you might want to use a piece of cartridge that's a little bit thick, or even cardboard. If you do make a hole in your draft, that's fine because we won't need to use it again. But just pushing with a bit of firmness into that, because we want that to be visible on our foam underneath. So I'm just pressing with quite a bit of pressure and going over the same section a few times. If you do it too lightly, then that won't transfer over at all. So I am going through the paper a little bit, but that's fine. Like I said, we won't need to use the paper again. So just making sure we go a few times, and I'm just going to trace the rest of this image. So the reason why you would trace over your image onto the foam is because if you directly draw onto the foam and you make a mistake, it's very hard to get rid of that mistake later on. So by drawing your draft and then using that to trace over, you can make sure that your design is exactly how you want it, and you limit having to use more foam than what you would need if the kids make mistakes. Okay, so now I'm just going to lift that up. And I can see very lightly that that's indented into the foam. Now you might not be able to see that on the camera because it is quite light, but that will give me a guide of where to press into the foam. So now I can go directly onto the foam with my pencil. And as you can see, the lines will be quite thick when you press in with your pencil, much, much thicker than what they are drawing on the paper. So just make sure your students allow for that in their design. So things with very intricate patterns will be much harder to do if you're working with a blunt pencil onto the foam. So when you're working on the foam, what you'll find is straight lines are much easier to do than curved lines. You might find that your pencil gets stuck a little bit in the foam, but if that does happen and your students are finding it hard to carve a certain line, what you can do is stab with your pencil to create those marks and then draw through it to create a smoother line. Now I've got my design carved into the foam, and what I'm going to do is cut around this piece. That's because we're going to be creating multiple prints and we're going to be collaging them over the top of our background. So because I don't want it to be just a rectangular design with a fish in the middle, I think it'll look a lot nicer if it does have the outline, and it'll be much easier to work with the composition. So what I'm going to do is just trim off the edges, because the foam can have a tendency to snap in half, especially if you're doing something that's quite long. It's better to just cut out pieces so you don't risk that foam snapping. Alternatively, you could use a Stanley knife if your students were old enough to use one, but these scissors should be just as good. So what I'm going to do is make a few prints of this. So I'll print it onto one sheet of paper and then we'll create our background while the print dries. So now we're going to print our fish. So here I've just got a piece of transparency film. So I'm just using this to roll our paint out so we get it as a nice, even, smooth layer over the fish. So we've got our acrylic paint here. Alternatively, you could use a plastic tub or something similar. That's just to protect our table so we don't have to wipe it down. And then I've got my hard roller here. So you shouldn't need too much paint at all, but we are doing a few prints of this fish. So we will probably need to add a bit more later on. So just roll that through. So we want to make sure that we've got an even layer of paint across our whole roller. So I'll just roll the same way a few times. There we go. Now I don't want to get any paint on the table because it's white and you'll notice it. So I'll just put this over our piece of paper, just as a rolling mat. So this can be a little bit fiddly if you've got quite a small design, but as long as you have something on the table, then you shouldn't need to wipe down anything. So there we've got a nice even layer of paint. And sometimes with printing, it's a bit of a guessing game of how much paint you need. So we don't want too much, otherwise it will go in between all of those lines and take away all of our detail. So that will hopefully be enough, especially in warm climates as well. You'll notice that the paint dries a lot quicker, so you have to work a lot faster. But sometimes it can be quite nice if the paint is a little spotty here and there. It can work with your design, especially if you're working with organic forms or shapes. So just give that a nice even rub. And I prefer putting the paper on top of the foam as opposed to pressing the foam down on the paper. One reason is because kids can be a bit heavy-handed with the foam, and if they're pressing down on it, then they can accidentally cause it to snap. Also, when you put the paper on top, you can see if the paint is absorbing through. So we'll peel that back. And as you can see with that, it's dried up a little bit as it is quite warm in here at the moment, and we probably could have used a bit more paint, but I kind of like that shape, especially with the fish design. It's got a little bit of texture in it, kind of looking a bit like scale, so I don't mind that at all, but we will make a few other prints. So if you're doing something like this with the kids, then you could get them to make quite a few prints, and then they can choose which ones they like at the end of the lesson to use for their collage. So we'll roll some more paint through, so we don't want it to be too dry. Also, a risk of when you are printing is if you do leave the paper on your foam for too long, it can be a bit sticky and it can stick and rip the paper. So you do want to work fast if it is a little bit warm. So now we've got our second print inked up, and then we'll put the paper back over the top. So I'm going to try and work a bit more quickly with this one, just so we don't get any of that paper sticking. Pull that back. So as you can see, that one's a lot darker, and that worked out a bit better than the first one. And that's just because we used more paint and we did the print a bit more quick than that first one. So I will make a few more prints, and then you can see the difference in how they turn out. But especially with printmaking activities, it's always good to do a few prints, especially so the kids can choose which ones they like, and it's all just a learning process. So you figure out how much paint you need, what works, what doesn't work. So it's always good to do multiples. When you are also doing these prints, don't worry too much if the rest of your paper gets a little bit dirtied or muddied by some extra paint, because we will be cutting out these fish later on. Okay, Okay, so now we've finished our 4 prints and they all look a little bit different. So you can see some of them are a bit more dry than others, but it's all just practice in applying that paint. I kind of like the look of the ones that have a little bit less paint in them, but we can decide which ones to use in the collage a bit later on. So now I'm just going to roll off the excess paint on my roller. Saves washing time, which is always good. And you can either keep these plastic sheets if you do want to roll more paint later and wash these off. So they're quite handy to keep. I'll just put that to the side. I didn't do so well at keeping the table clean. Okay, so now I'm just going to leave these prints to the side to dry. So if this was a lesson, then I might leave that until the next class to continue on with. And what I'm going to do now is just create our background for these fish to sit on. So over here, I've just got some tissue paper. So with this tissue paper, what I'm going to do is tear it and stick it down. So this will create our ocean scene. So I'm going to be using a few different colours for this tissue paper background. That's just to create a bit more interest in the scene, and you'll see the different tears in the paper and the different shapes. If it was all the same colour, then you'd lose all of that nice texture and that nice collage look. So by using a few different colours, even if they're just different tones of the same colour, it will create a lot more interest in that background. Okay, so now I've got a few piles of different colours of torn tissue paper. It's much easier to tear all of your tissue paper before you start sticking because your hands will get gluey, and that's never a fun time when you've got bits of paper stuck to your hands. I'm just using a glue stick to apply the tissue paper. You won't need anything that's too strong because the tissue paper is so light it will adhere quite easily by just using the glue stick. I'm just going to start a section at a time. That's just so we don't get glue everywhere. So as you can see, I'm just sticking down the tissue paper quite roughly. This is because I like the texture and the look of it in the background. So you could smooth it down more and get rid of all the wrinkles, but I think for something like this, that organic feel is really nice. So you don't have to be too precise about how well it's staying down. Even little pieces that are sticking out will look quite nice. Okay, so now I've finished my tissue paper background, and as you can see, it's still a little bit rough where I haven't stuck down all the pieces, but I don't mind that. It adds that texture and that quality to it. I've also left some of the sides untrimmed. You could trim that up if you want them to look a bit neater, but I'm quite happy with that. So what I'm going to do now is just get our prints that we did before. They are pretty much dry now because it is so warm in here. And what I'm going to do is just cut them out, and then we'll use them over the top of our tissue paper. So now I've cut out my 3 prints, so I've just chosen these 3 to work with, and what I'm going to do now is just lay them where I think I want to place them over our collage. So that looks pretty good there. And just to give it a little bit more depth, what I'm going to do is use the foam tape on these. So this will just lift them up a little bit to make them look higher than the background. Alternatively, you could use cardboard and stick a piece of cardboard underneath, but this is just a little bit easier for us to work with. So I'm just going to cut a strip and then place that just on this other side. So it works very much like double-sided tape, except it's got a little bit more height to it. Okay, so now that we've got our fish taped onto the piece of paper, I'm just going to bring out its fins and its tail to give it more of that 3D look. So this will make it look like it's popping out of the scene. There we go. Okay, so now we've finished our prints with our tissue paper background. This is just a really nice way of extending on foam printing, so you are able to use multiple prints in the same collage. If you were working on an under the sea theme with your students, then you could create a big collaborative or group work with the students, incorporating all of their different designs. So this is quite a nice little activity, especially if you're doing printmaking with younger students or you're just introducing older students to printmaking for the first time. That's all for today. I hope you enjoyed it, and don't forget to like and subscribe. It really does help us keep our job. Oopsies.